There are moments in history when a single person glimpses something the rest of humanity has been blind to for millennia. Not through superhuman intelligence, but through a particular kind of attention, a willingness to wonder about what everyone else has dismissed as ordinary. In 1874, in a villa nestled among the hills of Bologna, Italy, a boy named Guglielmo Marconi pressed his ear against his mother's piano and heard something extraordinary. The strings were singing, yes, but so too were the telegraph wires running past their window. They hummed in sympathy, vibrating to frequencies his mother's fingers had never touched. The air itself, he realized, was carrying something invisible between them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Consider what it means to discover that space is not empty. We take this for granted now, living as we do in a world saturated with invisible signals, our pockets filled with devices that speak constantly to towers we never see. But for young Marconi, this was a revelation that bordered on the mystical. The telegraph wires that crisscrossed Europe carried messages through copper, yes, but something was leaking out, propagating through the void itself. Something was speaking in a language older than words. His father, Giuseppe, was a practical man, a landowner who understood soil and crops and the reliable mathematics of agriculture. He saw his son's fascination with electricity as an expensive distraction from serious pursuits. But Annie Jameson Marconi, Guglielmo's Irish mother, recognized something different in her son's obsession. She had brought to their marriage an inheritance and an education that valued curiosity over convention. When Guglielmo begged for books on electromagnetic theory, she bought them. When he asked for laboratory equipment, she found the money her husband would have denied. At age 20, Marconi encountered the work of Heinrich Hertz, a German physicist who had died just months earlier in 1894. Hertz had proven what James Clerk Maxwell had predicted decades before, that light itself was merely one form of electromagnetic wave, that there existed an entire spectrum of invisible radiations traveling through space at precisely 186,000 miles per second. Hertz had generated these waves artificially, made them ring bells and deflect compass needles across the small confines of his laboratory. But he had declared them scientifically interesting yet practically useless, a curiosity without application. Marconi read those papers by candlelight and saw something Hertz had missed. If these waves could travel through empty air, if they could pass through walls and across rooms, then perhaps they could carry messages. Perhaps they could free communication from the tyranny of wires. His father's attic became a cathedral of copper and glass. Here, in a space that smelled of dust and old leather, Marconi began his midnight experiments. He was not trained as a physicist. He had failed to gain admission to the University of Bologna. But what he lacked in formal education, he compensated for with a methodical patience that would have impressed any scientist. He worked through the night, sleeping in brief intervals on a cot pushed against the wall, waking to adjust a coil or measure a spark gap with calipers accurate to fractions of millimeters. The equipment he built was crude but purposeful. An induction coil, scavenged from medical equipment meant to deliver electrical therapy, became his signal generator. When electric current surged through it, a spark leapt across a tiny gap, and in that violent discharge, electromagnetic waves radiated outward at the speed of light. He built what physicists called a Hertzian oscillator, but Marconi thought of it differently. He thought of it as a voice crying out in a language that had no words. The receiving end was equally simple, equally profound. A coherer, a glass tube filled with metal filings, sat connected to a battery and a bell. Under normal circumstances, the filings lay scattered, unable to conduct electricity. But when electromagnetic waves washed over them, something miraculous occurred. The filings aligned themselves, cohered, completing the circuit. The bell rang. A message had arrived from across empty space. Night after night, Marconi refined his apparatus. He raised his antennas higher, first 3 feet, then 10, then 30, reaching toward the ceiling like copper vines seeking sunlight. He adjusted the length of wire, the size of metal plates, the distance between spark gaps. He was tuning his equipment the way a musician tunes an instrument, searching for resonance in the electromagnetic spectrum. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind, both systematic and imaginative. He recorded everything: the humidity, the air pressure, the exact configuration of each component. When a signal traveled farther, he noted the conditions meticulously. When it failed, he analyzed why. He was teaching himself physics through experiment, deriving laws from observation rather than learning them from textbooks. By 1895, his invisible messages were traveling 30 feet reliably, then 300 feet, then across the entire length of his father's estate. Each increase in distance felt like breaking through an invisible barrier. He was having a conversation with nature, asking questions in the language of electromagnetic waves and listening carefully to the answers. His family watched this obsession with mixed feelings. His father saw money and time disappearing into an attic laboratory. His mother saw genius emerging from adolescent curiosity. His brother Alfonso became his assistant, patient and loyal, willing to stand in the rain, holding, receiving equipment, while Guglielmo adjusted transmitters in the villa. The crucial breakthrough came when Marconi realized that connecting one side of his transmitter directly to the Earth itself multiplied his signal strength by 50 times. The ground became part of his antenna system, a vast conducting plane that helped launch his electromagnetic waves into the air. It was elegant and unexpected, this partnership between human technology and the planet itself. In the summer of that year, Alfonso climbed a distant hill carrying a receiver, a battery, and a rifle. The plan was simple. If Alfonso's receiver detected the signal Guglielmo would send from the villa, he was to fire the rifle. The report would confirm what no equation yet predicted, that electromagnetic waves could travel over hills and through forests, that they could propagate beyond the line of sight. Guglielmo watched from the villa's window, his hand on the telegraph key that would trigger his transmitter. He pressed down. Somewhere over 2 miles away, through solid rock and living trees, his electromagnetic pulse was racing forward at the speed of light. Time stretched. The seconds felt like hours. And then, faint but unmistakable, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley. It was the sound heard round the scientific world, though the world didn't know it yet. In that moment, communication became untethered from physical connection. Messages had learned to fly. Marconi understood immediately that he had discovered something civilization would transform itself to possess. He imagined ships at sea able to call for help across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. He imagined armies coordinating movements without vulnerable telegraph lines. He imagined news traveling instantaneously across continents. The practical applications were obvious to him, even if the theoretical physicists who would later study his work remained skeptical. But there was something deeper too, something he felt but couldn't quite articulate. He had tapped into something that had been there all along, invisible electromagnetic waves that had been flowing through space since the birth of stars. Since the first lightning bolt split the primordial sky, humanity had been swimming in this invisible ocean forever, breathing it in, walking through it, completely unaware. Now, for the first time, someone had learned to speak in its language. Each component of his system was evolving like a living organism, adapting to its environment. The coherer detector improved from detecting sparks at 10 feet to sensing whispers at 10 miles. His antenna systems grew more sophisticated. No longer simple wires, but complex arrays that captured electromagnetic waves the way spiderwebs catch morning dew. With mathematical precision disguised as organic form, he worked with an intensity that worried his mother. Days blurred into nights. He ate little, slept less, but he was happy in a way that only people consumed by meaningful work can understand. He was not just building equipment. He was building a bridge between humanity and a force of nature we had never properly acknowledged. By the end of 1895, Marconi could transmit clear signals over distances approaching 3 miles. His father's skepticism was beginning to crack. Even Giuseppe could see that something unprecedented was happening in his attic. The Italian government showed mild interest, but no real enthusiasm. They were a nation still stitching itself together from separate kingdoms, more concerned with terrestrial borders than invisible waves. Marconi realized he would need to leave Italy to make the world pay attention. His mother's connections in England, her homeland, might offer opportunities that provincial Bologna could not. But he was reluctant to go. This attic had become sacred to him, the place where he had first learned to speak with the invisible. On quiet nights, when his experiments were complete and dawn approached, Marconi would sometimes just sit among his equipment, listening to the silence. But it wasn't really silent, was it? The electromagnetic spectrum hummed all around him, invisible, inaudible, yet utterly real. Lightning strikes thousands of miles away sent their electromagnetic signatures racing across the planet. The sun's corona, 93 million miles distant, poured electromagnetic radiation toward Earth constantly. The universe itself was singing, and he had built an instrument that could hear a few notes of that infinite song. He thought about Heinrich Hertz, dead at 36, never knowing that his useless discovery would transform human civilization. He thought about James Clerk Maxwell, who had predicted these waves mathematically decades earlier, but never lived to see them generated. He thought about all the scientists whose work had brought him to this moment, giants whose shoulders he stood upon, though he barely reached their knees in formal training. But perhaps that was his advantage. He came to wireless telegraphy without the weight of traditional physics telling him what was impossible. He experimented rather than calculated. He built rather than theorized. And in doing so, he stumbled upon solutions that more rigorous minds might have dismissed as improbable. The electromagnetic waves that would eventually carry human voices. Television images, internet data, and satellite communications were flowing all around that Italian villa in 1895. They had always been there, waiting. It took a young man with a pianist mother and a skeptical father, working in an attic by candlelight, to finally reach out and touch them, to make them useful, to give humanity a new sense with which to perceive reality. This is what innovation often looks like. Not a flash of divine inspiration, but years of patient attention, countless small adjustments, the willingness to fail repeatedly while learning from each failure. Marconi was discovering something profound about the nature of progress itself. You don't conquer nature. You listen to it. You learn its language. You work with it rather than against it. As 1896 approached, Marconi knew his time in the attic was ending. He had proven what needed proving. Wireless telegraphy worked. Now he needed to prove it to the world. He carefully packed his equipment, each component wrapped in cloth, each adjustment documented in notebooks he would guard like religious texts. His mother made arrangements for their departure to England. His father shook his head, but provided funding, still uncertain whether his son was a genius or merely obsessed. The attic fell silent, but the electromagnetic waves continued their eternal dance, invisible messengers carrying lightning's poetry across the sky, waiting for the next person who would learn to hear them speak. The summer of 1895 belonged to incremental miracles. Each morning, Marconi would wake before dawn, the Bolognese countryside still wrapped in mist, and climb to his laboratory with the focused intensity of a monk approaching prayer. But his devotion was to electromagnetic waves, and his prayers were experiments measured in fractions of millimeters and degrees of arc. 30 feet had become 300. 300 became 600. The invisible messages were creeping outward like a tide that recognized no shore. But distance alone was not the only mystery Marconi needed to solve. Reliability mattered. Consistency mattered. A technology that worked only under perfect conditions Only when the humidity sat at precisely the right level and the wind blew from precisely the right direction would never transform civilization. He attacked each variable systematically. The coherer, that glass tube filled with metal filings, was maddeningly inconsistent. Sometimes it responded to the faintest whisper of electromagnetic energy. Sometimes it ignored signals strong enough to spark across gaps visible to the naked eye. Marconi discovered that the type of metal mattered enormously. Pure nickel filings were too sluggish, pure silver too sensitive. But a mixture, carefully proportioned, created a detector that could sense signals at distances that seemed impossible given the power of his transmitter. The antenna became an obsession within an obsession. Height clearly mattered, but so did shape, diameter, the angle at which wires were strung. Marconi began to think of his antennas as living things, organisms that gathered invisible energy from the air the way plants gather sunlight. He experimented with horizontal wires, vertical wires, wires arranged in geometric patterns that would have looked occult to anyone who didn't understand their purpose. And then came the discovery that would multiply his range beyond any prediction. One afternoon, frustrated by weak signals, Marconi connected one terminal of his transmitter directly to the earth itself, driving a copper rod deep into the soil of his father's estate. The other terminal reached skyward on a wire stretched between poles. When he activated the transmitter, the signal strength exploded. What had traveled 300 feet now reached 3,000. What had barely penetrated walls now passed through hills. He had turned the planet into part of his antenna system. The Earth itself became a conductor, a vast metallic sphere that served as one half of his electromagnetic conversation. It was elegant. It was unexpected, and it worked with a reliability that thrilled him. His brother Alfonso, patient Alfonso, became the other half of countless experiments. While Guglielmo adjusted equipment at the villa, Alfonso would trek across the estate, carrying receivers, batteries, and that rifle whose reports confirmed each success. They developed a language of signals. One shot meant the receiver had detected the transmission. 2 shots meant nothing had arrived. 3 shots meant something unexpected had occurred. Come quickly. The landscape between them became a laboratory. Stone walls, dense forests, the natural curve of hills, all became variables to test. Marconi wanted to know what electromagnetic waves could penetrate, what they could circumvent, how they behaved in the real messy world beyond controlled experiments. Classical physics suggested that radio waves, like light, should travel only in straight lines. Mountains should block them absolutely. But Marconi's experiments told a different story. In July of 1895, Alfonso climbed the highest hill on the estate, a prominence called Celestini, over 2 miles from the villa. Between them lay not just distance, but solid geology, living forest, the accumulated matter of an ancient landscape. Marconi had calculated the necessary power, adjusted his spark gap to produce the strongest possible burst of electromagnetic energy. He had fine-tuned his transmitter obsessively, like a marksman checking and rechecking his rifle before an important shot. Alfonso waited on that distant hill. The receiver connected to a simple electrical bell, the rifle loaded and ready. Marconi, watching from the villa's window, took a breath and pressed the telegraph key. The spark leapt. The electromagnetic pulse radiated outward at 186,000 miles per second. Faster than thought, faster than anything except light itself, because it was light. Just light of a wavelength human eyes could never see. The seconds stretched. Marconi counted his heartbeats, and then, carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable, the crack of Alfonso's rifle. The signal had arrived. Electromagnetic waves had traveled through solid matter, had bent around obstacles, had found their way across a landscape that should have been impossible to traverse. It was in that moment that wireless telegraphy stopped being a laboratory curiosity and became something inevitable. Marconi knew, with absolute certainty, that he had discovered something that would change everything. Ships would never be isolated again. Armies would coordinate across vast distances. News would travel at the speed of light, rather than the speed of horses or trains. The world was about to become smaller, more connected, more aware of itself as a single entity rather than isolated nations and continents. But knowing something works and convincing the world to care are entirely different challenges. Marconi approached the Italian Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs with his discovery. They listened politely. They expressed mild interest. They did nothing. Italy, still finding its identity as a unified nation, had more pressing concerns than invisible waves. The officials could not imagine why anyone would need wireless communication when perfectly good telegraph wires already crisscrossed the continent. Marconi's mother understood what the Italian government did not. Annie Jameson Marconi had connections in England, family ties that could open doors. Italian provincialism kept closed. She began writing letters, describing her son's achievement in terms that might intrigue British engineers and investors. England, with its vast maritime empire, might understand the value of ship-to-shore communication in ways that landlocked Italian bureaucrats could not. While his mother worked diplomatic channels, Marconi continued refining his equipment. Each component evolved through countless iterations. The coherer became more sensitive, responding to signals that would have been invisible to earlier versions. He discovered that tapping the device gently after each signal restored the metal filings to their original scattered state, ready to detect the next transmission. This simple mechanical addition, a small hammer activated by the same electrical pulse that rang the bell, transformed the coherer from a one-use detector into a reliable receiver that could register multiple messages. His transmitter evolved too. The spark gap, the heart of his system, required constant adjustment. Too wide and no spark would jump. Too narrow and the spark was weak, generating insufficient electromagnetic radiation. Marconi learned to read the quality of a spark the way a musician reads the quality of a note. The color, the sound, the way it smelled, all told him something about the electromagnetic waves radiating outward. He experimented with different shapes for the spark gap electrodes. Spheres produced one characteristic. Sharp points produced another. Flat surfaces produced yet a third. Each configuration generated electromagnetic waves with slightly different properties, different frequencies, different patterns of radiation. He was learning to sculpt invisible phenomena, to shape electromagnetic energy the way a potter shapes clay. By autumn of 1895, Marconi could transmit reliably across the entire length of his father's estate over 2 miles of complex terrain. But 2 miles was not enough to interest investors or governments. He needed to demonstrate that his invention could work at scales that mattered for practical communication. He needed to show that wireless telegraphy could compete with, and eventually surpass, the wired telegraph systems that had taken decades and fortunes to construct. The physics of what was happening remained mysterious even to Marconi. He knew electromagnetic waves were radiating from his antenna. He knew they were traveling through space and being detected at a distance. But the mechanisms by which they propagated, the reasons they could bend around obstacles and penetrate solid matter, these remained opaque. Later scientists would discover that radio waves diffract around obstacles, that they reflect off the ionosphere, that they follow the curve of the Earth through mechanisms Marconi could not have predicted. But in 1895, he simply observed that they worked, and worked consistently enough to be useful. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind grappling with phenomena that defied intuition. He wrote questions to himself. Why do signals travel farther at night? Why does moisture in the air seem to help rather than hinder transmission? Why do certain antenna configurations work better than others, even when the total length of wire remains constant? These were not idle curiosities. Each question led to experiments, and each experiment refined his understanding. The coherer detector, simple as it appeared, embodied mysteries that physicists would puzzle over for decades. Metal filings, when struck by electromagnetic waves, somehow aligned themselves, cohered, became conductive. The mechanism involved electromagnetic induction, the generation of tiny currents in each individual filing, currents that welded the particles together momentarily. But Marconi didn't need to understand the deep physics to exploit the phenomenon. He needed it to work reliably, and through patient iteration, he made it work. His antenna systems were growing more sophisticated. He discovered that connecting multiple wires in parallel, like the strings of a harp, improved reception. He found that certain geometric arrangements resonated with his transmitter's frequency, amplifying signals naturally without requiring additional power. He was building the first tuned antennas, though the theory of resonance and impedance matching would come later. Formalized by other physicists studying his work, the concept of tuning, of creating transmitters and receivers that responded to specific frequencies while ignoring others, was still years away from systematic implementation. But Marconi was stumbling toward it through experiment. He noticed that when he adjusted the length of his antenna wires to specific proportions relative to the wavelength he was transmitting, signals became clearer, stronger, more distinct. He was learning to match his equipment to the invisible waves it generated and detected. By December, with winter settling over Bologna, Marconi had achieved transmission distances approaching 3 miles under optimal conditions. His equipment filled several wooden crates. His notebooks contained thousands of observations. His understanding of electromagnetic propagation, though incomplete by later standards, was more sophisticated than any other experimenter had achieved. He was ready to leave Italy, but leaving meant abandoning the laboratory where he had made his discoveries, the attic that had become a kind of sacred space. He spent his final weeks in Bologna documenting everything, drawing detailed diagrams of each component, recording the specifications that had proven most successful. He knew that in England he would need to recreate his equipment, to demonstrate his invention to skeptics who would demand proof beyond anything Italian provincial officials had required. His father, Giuseppe, remained ambivalent. He had watched his son transform from a boy fascinated by piano vibrations into a young man who spoke confidently about revolutionizing global communication. Part of him was proud. Part of him worried about the money, the time, the possibility of failure in a foreign country. But Annie Marconi had made the decision. They would go to England. Guglielmo would demonstrate his wireless telegraphy to people who could appreciate its significance. On a cold January morning in 1896, Marconi carefully loaded his equipment into traveling cases. Each component was wrapped in cloth, protected against the jolts and vibrations of travel. His notebooks went into a leather satchel that never left his side. His mother had made arrangements for their accommodation in London. His brother Alfonso would remain in Italy, managing family affairs, but the bond forged between them during those months of experiments would last a lifetime. As the train carried them north toward the Alps and beyond, Marconi stared out the window at the telegraph wires running parallel to the tracks. They stretched from pole to pole, a physical infrastructure that had required immense capital and labor to construct. Within decades, he believed, much of that infrastructure would become obsolete. Messages would fly through the air itself, unbound by copper and poles, free to travel wherever electromagnetic waves could reach. He thought about Alfonso, standing on that distant hill, rifle in hand, firing the shot that announced a new age. He thought about the electromagnetic waves that were, even now, washing over the train, invisible and undetected except by equipment humans had only just learned to build. He thought about ships at sea, isolated and vulnerable, soon to be connected to shore by invisible threads of electromagnetic energy. The future was rushing toward him as fast as the Italian landscape rushed past the train window. But unlike the landscape, which grew more distant with each passing mile, the future was something he was helping to create. Every experiment, every adjustment, every small improvement in his equipment was bringing that future closer to the present. England waited. The British Empire, with its global communications needs and its engineering sophistication, waited. Skeptics waited, ready to dismiss wireless telegraphy as impossible or impractical. But Marconi was ready for them. He had spent 2 years learning to speak in the language of electromagnetic waves. Now he would teach that language to the world. London, in February of 1896, was a city that believed it understood the limits of possibility. The British Empire stretched across a quarter of the Earth's surface, connected by telegraph cables that lay on ocean floors and stretched across continents. The engineers who had built this network were among the most sophisticated in the world. They knew what communication required: copper wire, insulation, relay stations, physical infrastructure that could be touched and measured and maintained. The idea that messages might fly through empty air struck many of them as somewhere between wishful thinking and outright fraud. Marconi arrived with his mother, his mysterious black boxes, and an unshakable conviction that he could prove the impossible. He was 22 years old. He spoke English with his mother's Irish accent layered over Italian vowels. He had no formal credentials, no university degrees, no published papers in prestigious journals. What he had was equipment that worked, notebooks filled with data, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having seen something work hundreds of times. Annie Marconi's family connections opened the first crucial door. A cousin introduced them to William Preece, the chief engineer of the British Post Office, a man responsible for the entire telegraph network of the United Kingdom. Preece was a curious figure, technically sophisticated but intellectually generous, willing to consider ideas that other engineers dismissed outright. He had himself experimented with wireless communication, using electromagnetic induction to send signals across short distances. But his work had plateaued at ranges measured in hundreds of yards. What Marconi described, transmission across miles, seemed to violate the inverse square law that governed electromagnetic radiation. The first demonstration took place on the roof of the General Post Office building in London. Marconi assembled his equipment with the methodical care of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. His transmitter, with its gleaming copper coils and precisely adjusted spark gap, looked both primitive and purposeful. His antenna wire stretched across the roof, supported by poles he had brought from Italy. The receiver sat in a room several hundred feet away, connected to nothing but its own antenna reaching skyward. Preece watched skeptically as Marconi prepared. Around them, other post office engineers gathered, men who had spent careers laying cables and maintaining physical connections. The idea that Marconi's equipment could send a signal across the building without any wire-connecting transmitter to receiver struck most of them as absurd. Electromagnetic waves weaken too quickly with distance. Any signal strong enough to travel hundreds of feet would require power supplies far larger than what Marconi had brought. Marconi pressed his telegraph key. The spark leapt. In the distant room, the bell rang. Pressed again. The bell rang again. The Morse code for the letter V, 3 short clicks followed by 1 long, traveled through empty air and was received perfectly. The engineers looked at each other. Some suspected hidden wires. Others assumed some trick with batteries or mechanical relays. But Preece understood immediately that something genuine was occurring. Over the following weeks, Marconi demonstrated his system repeatedly, each time increasing the distance, each time refining the equipment to work more reliably. From the roof of the General Post Office to a building 400 yards away, from that building to another across the Thames River, each successful transmission converted another skeptic. Though many remained convinced there must be practical limitations that would prevent wireless telegraphy from ever competing with established cable systems, the British scientific establishment was less easily convinced than the post office engineers. Lord Kelvin, perhaps the most prestigious physicist in Britain, declared wireless telegraphy theoretically interesting but commercially impractical. The inverse square law was unforgiving. Electromagnetic radiation dispersed in all directions, spreading its energy across an ever-expanding sphere. To communicate across substantial distances would require transmitter power that increased exponentially, making the technology economically absurd. Marconi listened to these criticisms with respect, but without surrender. He knew what Lord Kelvin apparently did not, that the inverse square law described radiation in free space, but the real world provided mechanisms that concentrated and guided electromagnetic waves. The Earth itself acted as a reflector. The atmosphere had structure, layers of ionized gas, that would later be understood to bounce radio waves back toward the surface. Marconi didn't know the theory yet, but he had empirical evidence that signals traveled farther than pure theory predicted. In May of 1896, Brice arranged a demonstration on Salisbury Plain, a vast open landscape in southern England used for military training. This would be the definitive test. Marconi would transmit from one location while receivers placed at increasing distances would attempt to detect his signals. If wireless telegraphy was to be more than a laboratory curiosity, it needed to work at ranges measured in miles, not yards. The demonstration took 3 days of preparation. Marconi erected antenna poles 14 feet high, higher than anything he had used in Italy. His transmitter consumed power from batteries that required constant recharging. The spark gap was adjusted and readjusted until the sparks leapt with maximum violence, generating the strongest possible electromagnetic pulses. Teams with receiving equipment positioned themselves at quarter-mile intervals, stretching across the plain. On the morning of the demonstration, wind gusted across the open landscape at speeds approaching 60 miles per hour. The antenna wires whipped and vibrated. Several observers suggested postponing until conditions improved, but Marconi insisted on proceeding. If wireless telegraphy was to be useful for ships at sea or military operations in the field, it needed to work in adverse conditions, not just in calm weather. The first transmission traveled a quarter-mile perfectly, then half a mile, then 3/4. At 1 mile, the signal remained clear. At 1.25 miles, still detectable. At 1.5 miles, the receivers rang with each transmission. Engineers who had traveled from London to witness what they expected to be a failure found themselves revising their understanding of what was possible. But the real triumph came at the 2-mile mark. The receiver sat in a valley, blocked from direct line of sight to Marconi's transmitter by rising ground. Classical physics insisted that electromagnetic waves, like light, could not bend around obstacles. The signal should have been completely blocked. Yet when Marconi transmitted, the distant receiver responded. The electromagnetic waves were somehow following the curve of the terrain, propagating in ways that defied simple geometric prediction. Lord Kelvin, present for the demonstration, spent the afternoon arguing with other physicists about what they had witnessed. Some proposed that the signals were reflecting off clouds. Others suggested the wind was somehow carrying electrical charges. Marconi simply smiled and continued transmitting. He didn't need to understand the complete physics to know that his system worked. Over the following months, Marconi conducted 47 public demonstrations across England and Wales. Each one refined his technique. Each one taught him something new about how electromagnetic waves behaved in different environments. He transmitted across the Bristol Channel, 8 miles of open water between Wales and England, proving that wireless telegraphy could work over maritime distances. He sent signals through fog so thick that ship's captains lost all visual orientation, demonstrating that his invisible messages were immune to weather that blinded human eyes. But success bred competition, and competition bred interference. During a crucial demonstration at the Royal Institution in London, with members of Parliament and prominent scientists in attendance, Marconi's receiver began ringing chaotically, detecting signals he was not transmitting. Someone, somewhere nearby, was operating another wireless transmitter on the same frequencies, deliberately jamming his demonstration. This was the moment that revealed Marconi's deepest innovation. He had not just invented wireless telegraphy, he had invented syntonic tuning, the ability to send multiple messages through the same space without interference. Like multiple conversations occurring in a crowded room where each person hears only the voice they are listening for. With theatrical timing, Marconi adjusted a dial on his equipment. The chaotic ringing stopped. He transmitted his intended message. The receiver responded perfectly, ignoring the interfering signals that continued to flood the electromagnetic spectrum around them. He had demonstrated what physicists would later call frequency selectivity, the ability to tune transmitters and receivers to specific wavelengths while ignoring all others. The principle was elegant. Just as a tuning fork vibrates sympathetically only to sounds matching its natural frequency, Marconi's tuned circuits responded only to electromagnetic waves of specific wavelengths. He adjusted the electrical properties of his circuits, the inductance and capacitance, until transmitter and receiver resonated at the same frequency, a matched pair that could find each other in the electromagnetic chaos. This was the breakthrough that transformed wireless telegraphy from a single-channel curiosity into a multi-channel communication medium. Without tuning, only one wireless conversation could occur at a time across any given region. With syntonic tuning, dozens, eventually hundreds, of simultaneous wireless messages could flow through the same space, each pair of transmitter and receiver locked to its own unique frequency, oblivious to all the others. The British press began calling him the Wireless Wizard, a title that annoyed serious scientists but delighted the public. Marconi walked a careful line between showmanship and scientific credibility. He needed publicity to attract investors and customers, but he also needed the respect of engineers who would implement his technology. Too much spectacle and he would be dismissed as a charlatan. Too little, and his invention might be overlooked in favor of other emerging technologies. He filed his first British patent in June of 1896. Document number 12,399, titled Improvements in Transmitting Electrical Impulses and Signals, and in apparatus, therefore. The language was deliberately broad, claiming not just his specific equipment, but the general principle of using electromagnetic waves for wireless communication. It would become one of the most valuable patents in history, the foundation of a wireless empire. Money began flowing toward the young Italian inventor. The British Post Office provided funding for continued experiments. Private investors, sensing the commercial potential of ship-to-shore communication, offered capital for a wireless company. Marconi found himself negotiating contracts and licensing agreements, roles he had never imagined when he was adjusting spark gaps in his father's attic. But he never forgot that the technology remained incomplete. His transmitters consumed enormous amounts of power. His receivers were still finicky, requiring constant adjustment and maintenance. The maximum reliable range, while impressive, was still measured in single-digit miles. If wireless telegraphy was to fulfill its potential, every component needed further refinement. He assembled a team of engineers and experimenters, men who shared his obsessive attention to detail. Together, they tested hundreds of antenna configurations: vertical antennas, horizontal antennas, umbrella antennas that spread wires like spokes from a central mast. Each design captured electromagnetic energy slightly differently. Each had advantages for specific applications. The coherer detector, that simple tube of metal filings, reached the limits of its design. Marconi began experimenting with alternative detectors, magnetic devices that responded to electromagnetic waves by changing their orientation. Electrolytic detectors that used chemical reactions to sense signals. Each new detector offered improvements in sensitivity or speed or reliability, pushing the boundaries of what wireless receivers could detect. His transmitters evolved from spark gaps to more sophisticated designs. He discovered that enclosing the spark in a magnetic field focused the electromagnetic radiation, making it more directional, more powerful in specific directions. He experimented with different rates of spark discharge, learning that faster sparks generated broader frequency spectrums, while slower sparks produced more focused electromagnetic energy. By the end of 1896, Marconi's wireless signals were traveling reliably across 10 miles under most conditions, occasionally reaching 15 miles when atmospheric conditions were favorable. These were not the dramatic intercontinental distances he would later achieve, but they were sufficient to demonstrate commercial viability. Ships approaching ports could signal their arrival while still beyond the horizon. Lighthouses could communicate with shore stations through fog and storms. Military units could coordinate movements without laying vulnerable telegraph lines. The British Admiralty took particular interest. Naval warfare depended on communication, and communication depended on vulnerable signal flags and line-of-sight visual messages. Wireless telegraphy offered the possibility of fleets coordinating across dozens of miles, ships remaining in contact even when scattered by weather or battle. The Admiralty arranged trials, equipping naval vessels with Marconi's equipment to test its reliability at sea. These maritime tests revealed new challenges. The rolling and pitching of ships made antenna installation difficult. Salt spray corroded equipment. The electrical noise generated by a ship's engines interfered with receivers, but each problem generated solutions. Marconi developed weatherproof housings, improved grounding systems, better shielding for sensitive components. The equipment that had worked beautifully on dry land evolved to survive the harsh environment of the open ocean. In December of 1897, Marconi achieved what many had declared impossible. He transmitted wireless messages between the shore and a ship 20 miles at sea. The distance was not particularly impressive by later standards, but the significance was profound. For the first time in human history, a moving vessel had maintained continuous communication with land across distances that would have severed any physical connection. The captain of that ship, watching Morse code appear on the receiver's tape as invisible signals arrived from beyond the horizon, understood that he was witnessing the death of maritime isolation. Ships would never again be cut off from human civilization once they sailed beyond sight of land. Help could be summoned. Weather warnings could be received. Passengers could send messages to families ashore. The ocean, which had always separated and isolated, would become just another medium through which communication flowed. Marconi himself felt the weight of what he had achieved. Standing on the deck of that ship, watching the coast of England disappear behind them while wireless signals continued arriving from the shore station, he knew that the Attic experiments in Bologna had become something far larger than he had initially imagined. He had not just invented a technology. He had changed humanity's relationship with distance and isolation. But the Atlantic Ocean waited, 2,000 miles of empty water that many insisted wireless signals could never cross. The curvature of the Earth alone would carry signals into space after a few hundred miles. The mathematical models were unforgiving. Long-distance wireless telegraphy was theoretically impossible. Marconi, who had already proven the theoretically impossible several times, began planning his most ambitious experiment yet. He would send a signal across the Atlantic, or he would prove that there were limits even electromagnetic waves could not transcend. The Atlantic Ocean stretches 2,100 miles between Cornwall and Newfoundland, a vast expanse of empty water that had separated continents since before humans walked upright. Beneath its surface lay telegraph cables, copper threads encased in protective layers, expensive infrastructure that took years to lay and fortunes to maintain. These cables carried messages between Europe and North America at substantial cost. Marconi proposed to make them obsolete. The mathematics were brutally simple. Radio waves travel in straight lines. The Earth is curved. After 200 miles, any signal transmitted horizontally would shoot off into space, following the geometric tangent while the planet's surface curved away beneath it. Every physicist who examined Marconi's proposal reached the same conclusion. Transatlantic wireless telegraphy was impossible. The curvature of the Earth made it so. Marconi listened to these calculations with the polite attention of someone who had heard similar certainties proven wrong before. He knew something the mathematicians apparently did not. that electromagnetic waves had surprised everyone repeatedly, propagating farther than theory predicted, bending around obstacles that should have blocked them completely. Perhaps the Atlantic would reveal another surprise. In 1900, he began construction of two massive wireless stations, one at Poldhu in Cornwall, England, the other at Cape Cod in Massachusetts. These would not be the portable equipment of earlier demonstrations. They would be industrial facilities, power stations dedicated to hurling electromagnetic energy across an ocean. The antenna at Poldhu was an engineering marvel and a structural nightmare. 20 masts, each 200 feet tall, arranged in a circle 400 feet across, supporting a conical web of copper wire that looked like an enormous inverted spider web. 400 separate wires converged at a central point, creating an antenna system unlike anything attempted before. The entire structure weighed several tons, swaying in Atlantic winds. Groaning under its own mass, the transmitter consumed 25 kilowatts of power, drawn from generators that required a dedicated building to house them. The spark gap was massive, capable of producing sparks 6 inches long that cracked like thunder and filled the air with the sharp smell of ozone. When the transmitter operated at full power, the electromagnetic pulse it generated was strong enough to light incandescent bulbs held near the antenna, pulling energy from invisible waves the way plants pull energy from sunlight. In September of 1901, disaster struck. A storm roared in from the Atlantic, with winds exceeding 90 miles per hour. The antenna array at Poldhu, that magnificent web of copper and timber, collapsed. 20 masts toppled like trees before an axe, 400 wires tangled in wreckage across the Cornish landscape. Months of work destroyed in hours. Investors questioned whether to continue funding. Engineers suggested redesigning from scratch. Marconi refused to surrender. Within weeks, a simpler antenna rose from the ruins, just 2 masts 150 feet tall, supporting 50 wires arranged in a fan shape. It was less elegant than the original design, less theoretically perfect, but it could be built quickly and could survive Atlantic weather. The transmitter was moved to a new building, better protected, more robust. By November, the Poldhu station was operational again, but the Cape Cod station had suffered its own catastrophe. Another storm, this one sweeping across Massachusetts, had destroyed the American antenna before it ever transmitted. Marconi needed an alternative receiving location, somewhere closer to Europe, to maximize the chance of detecting a weak signal. He chose Signal Hill in St. John's, Newfoundland, the closest point in North America to the British Isles. Signal Hill was hardly more than a barren rock overlooking the North Atlantic. No permanent structure existed there, suitable for a wireless station. In December of 1901, Marconi and his assistants hauled equipment up that wind-swept hill, battling weather that froze exposed skin and snapped antenna wires. There was no massive receiving antenna here, just a wire lifted 500 feet into the air by a kite, fragile and temporary, dancing in gales that sometimes reached hurricane force. The receiving equipment was cruder than anything Marconi had used in years. No recording devices, no reliable coherers, just a simple telephone receiver connected to a detector that converted electromagnetic waves into audio signals. Marconi would have to hear the signals directly, distinguish the faint Morse code letter S, 3 short clicks, from the roar of atmospheric static that filled the electromagnetic spectrum like an endless scream. December 12th, 1901. Across 2,000 miles of ocean, at the Poldhu station in Cornwall, operators began transmitting repeatedly at scheduled times, 10 dot, 12:30 dot, 1800 dot. The letter S in Morse code, ... the simplest possible message, repeated again and again, hurled into space with 25 kilowatts of power. On Signal Hill, Marconi pressed the telephone receiver against his ear. His assistant, George Kemp, held the other receiver. Both men listened through static that crackled and roared. electromagnetic noise generated by lightning strikes occurring somewhere on the planet, by the sun's radiation, by 1,000 natural sources. Finding a deliberate signal in that chaos seemed as unlikely as hearing a whisper in a hurricane. 12:30 p.m. Newfoundland time. The scheduled transmission from Poldhu should be arriving. Marconi strained to hear anything beyond the static. And then, faint but unmistakable, 3 clicks. ... The letter S. He looked at Kemp. Kemp nodded. Both had heard it. Marconi made a note in his logbook, the time, the detection, his certainty level. At 6 p.m. they listened again. The static seemed worse, electromagnetic chaos filling their ears. But then, again, faint as a ghost but structured as language, 3 clicks arriving in rhythm. ... The message had traveled 2,100 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, through weather, through the day-night boundary, arriving at Signal Hill as if the curve of the Earth did not exist. What neither Marconi nor anyone else understood in that moment was that the signal had not traveled in a straight line at all. High above the Earth, 60 miles up in the thin ionosphere, layers of ionized gas created by solar radiation had reflected Marconi's electromagnetic waves back toward the surface. The signal had bounced between the ionosphere and the ocean, like a ball bouncing between floor and ceiling, following the curve of the planet in a natural waveguide that physics would not fully explain for decades. Marconi knew only that the impossible had occurred. Wireless signals had crossed the Atlantic. The telegraph cable companies, which had declared his project foolish and uneconomic, were suddenly facing competition from thin air. The estimated cost of a transatlantic wireless message was a small fraction of cable telegram rates. The monopoly that had controlled transatlantic communication for decades was broken by electromagnetic waves and one man's refusal to accept theoretical limitations. The news exploded across both continents. Some scientists remained skeptical, demanding more proof, questioning whether Marconi had truly detected signals or merely heard what he wanted to hear in random static. But Marconi was already planning the next demonstration. Longer transmissions, actual messages rather than single letters. Proof that would satisfy even the most determined skeptic. Within months, he was sending complete wireless messages across the Atlantic, first simple words, then sentences, then full telegrams that newspapers published to prove the technology's viability. The signals remained unreliable, fading and strengthening according to patterns nobody yet understood, sometimes disappearing entirely for hours before returning. But the fundamental principle was proven. Distance was no longer an absolute barrier to wireless communication. The transatlantic cable companies, watching their monopoly evaporate, fought back through legal and regulatory channels. They convinced governments to impose restrictions on wireless telegraphy. They spread rumors about unreliability and security risks, but their desperation was transparent. They were defending old technology against new inevitability. Marconi's company, the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company, began installing equipment on ships crossing the Atlantic. Passengers could send wireless telegrams to shore for a few shillings per word, a novelty that became a status symbol. The wealthy delighted in sending wireless messages from mid-ocean, proving they had access to cutting-edge technology. The ship operators valued wireless for more practical reasons: weather reports, navigation warnings, the ability to coordinate with port authorities before arrival. The theoretical physicists who had declared transatlantic wireless impossible were forced to revise their models. If signals were reaching Newfoundland from Cornwall, something must be guiding them, bending them around the Earth's curve. The answer lay in the ionosphere, but that understanding would wait for decades of further research. In 1901, Marconi had proven experimentally what theory insisted could not occur, adding another example to his growing collection of impossible achievements made routine. Standing on Signal Hill in the days following that first detection, watching his kite antenna dance in Atlantic gales, Marconi thought about the electromagnetic waves washing over the planet constantly. Every lightning strike sent pulses racing around the world. The sun poured electromagnetic radiation across every wavelength. And now, human technology added its voice to that cosmic chorus. Messages coded in electromagnetic patterns, ideas traveling at light speed, connecting continents in ways that would have seemed magical to previous generations. The Atlantic, which had separated civilizations for all of human history, which had been crossed only by months-long voyages in wooden ships and expensive submarine cables, was now transparent to electromagnetic waves. Information could flow across it nearly instantaneously. A businessman in New York could receive news from London in minutes rather than days. A scientist in Dublin could collaborate with a colleague in Boston without the delays that had previously made such collaboration impractical. Marconi understood that he had not just invented a technology. He had changed the fundamental structure of human communication, accelerated the pace at which information could flow, begun the transformation of Earth from a collection of isolated regions into a single connected entity. The world was becoming smaller, not physically but informationally, every wireless station adding another node to a growing network that would eventually span the globe. But the story was far from complete. Wireless telegraphy still relied on Morse code, on trained operators translating between electromagnetic pulses and human language. The signals were crude, the equipment unreliable, the range limited by available power. The next revolution would come when wireless learned to carry not just coded clicks, but human voices themselves. When electromagnetic waves became a medium not just for telegrams, but for sound, for music, for the full richness of human expression. That transformation was already beginning, though few yet imagined where it would lead. The North Atlantic in April is a landscape of contradictions. Spring arrives on the calendar, but winter still rules the ocean. Icebergs carve from Greenland glaciers and drift south on currents older than human civilization. Frozen mountains weighing hundreds of thousands of tons, 9/10 hidden beneath black water. Ships crossing these waters navigate through a darkness punctuated only by stars and the running lights of distant vessels, each one isolated in the vastness, separated by miles of empty ocean. On the evening of April 14th, 1912, the RMS Titanic steamed through this frozen dark at 22 knots, her engines driving her forward with the confidence of engineering that believed itself unsinkable. She was the largest moving object humans had ever built, 882 feet of steel and luxury, carrying 2,224 souls toward New York. In her Marconi room, high in the superstructure, radio operator Jack Phillips sat before his wireless equipment, one hand on the telegraph key, the other adjusting the receiver, maintaining the ship's connection to a world that had receded beyond the horizon. The wireless equipment aboard Titanic represented the state of the art in 1912. A 5-kilowatt transmitter, powerful enough to communicate across 500 miles under good conditions, sat bolted to the deck, its spark gap protected in a soundproof box to muffle the thunder of high-voltage discharges. The antenna stretched between the ship's masts, 200 feet of copper wire swaying gently with the vessel's motion, gathering and radiating electromagnetic waves that connected this floating city to the rest of human civilization. Phillips was 25 years old, trained by the Marconi Company, part of a new profession that existed only because one Italian inventor had refused to believe messages needed wires. His shift had begun at 7 a.m. and should have ended hours ago. But ice warnings had been flooding in from other ships all day, messages requiring acknowledgement and relay, creating a backlog that kept him at his station well past midnight. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck an iceberg. The collision was not dramatic, more a grinding shudder than a violent impact, almost gentle in its catastrophic consequences. 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments opened to the sea. The engineering was brilliant but insufficient. The Titanic could survive 4 compartments flooding. 6 was fatal. The ship had perhaps 2 hours before the Atlantic claimed her. In the Marconi room, Phillips felt the shudder, noted the abrupt silence as the engines stopped, and waited for instructions. They came within minutes. Captain Smith appeared at the wireless room door. His face carried a certainty Phillips had never seen before. "Send the distress call." CQD, the international signal for all stations. Distress, then the ship's position. 41 degrees, 46 minutes north, 50 degrees, 14 minutes west. "Begin immediately." Phillips pressed the telegraph key. The spark leapt. 5 kilowatts of electromagnetic energy radiated from the antenna, traveling outward at the speed of light, invisible electromagnetic waves carrying the most important message Phillips would ever send. "CQD, CQD, CQD, Titanic calling, position. We have struck an iceberg. Require immediate assistance." The signal spread across 400 miles of ocean in less than 2 milliseconds, washing over every wireless receiver within range. On the Cunard liner Carpathia, 58 miles southeast of Titanic, radio operator Harold Cottam was preparing to shut down his equipment and sleep when he heard the distress call. He abandoned rest immediately, confirming receipt, calculating distances, sprinting to wake his captain. On the Mount Temple, 49 miles west, wireless operator John Durrant heard the call and woke his officers. On the Frankfurt, 150 miles south, the operator acknowledged receipt. On the Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, 500 miles east, the radio operator heard his siblings' distress and understood that by the time Olympic could arrive, the rescue would be finished or futile. The electromagnetic web that Marconi had woven across the ocean suddenly revealed its purpose. Ships that would have passed unseeing in the night, each isolated in its own pocket of darkness, were now aware of each other, coordinating rescue efforts across hundreds of miles. The Carpathia's captain, Arthur Rostron, made immediate decisions. Full speed toward Titanic's position, prepare lifeboats, ready medical supplies, alert passengers to prepare for survivors. His ship could travel 17 knots maximum. The 58 miles would require 3.5 hours. He hoped it would be enough. On Titanic, the situation deteriorated with mathematical certainty. Water flooded forward compartments, pulling the bow down, lifting the stern. The ship's designer had calculated she would last 2 hours. His mathematics proved grimly accurate. Passengers moved toward lifeboats, many still disbelieving that this magnificent vessel could actually sink. The crew maintained order, while understanding that the lifeboats could accommodate only half those aboard. In the wireless room, Phillips continued transmitting. His hand worked the telegraph key with mechanical rhythm, sending updates to the approaching Carpathia, relaying messages from passengers who understood this might be their last chance to communicate with loved ones ashore. CQD evolved into SOS, a newer distress signal that Marconi himself had helped standardize. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, simpler to transmit and recognize than the older code. His assistant, Harold Bride, helped manage the chaos, confirming receipts, calculating distances to responding ships, keeping the logbook updated with transmission times and confirmations. The wireless equipment consumed enormous power, but the ship's generators continued running, providing electricity even as the Atlantic poured through ruptured hull plates below. By 1:45 a.m., the Titanic's bow was completely submerged. The stern rose at an increasingly steep angle. Water reached the lower decks, flooding corridors where passengers had walked hours before. The last lifeboats departed, underfilled, because many passengers still refused to believe the ship could sink. On deck, the band played ragtime music, a defiant gesture of normalcy as the vessel died beneath them. In the wireless room, water began seeping under the door. Phillips continued transmitting, his hand on the key, his entire being focused on maintaining that electromagnetic connection to the rescue ships racing toward them through the dark. The spark gap fired again and again, each pulse sending electromagnetic waves racing outward, crying for help in the only language that could cross 400 miles of ocean instantly. At 2:05 a.m., the Titanic's electrical generators failed. The lights flickered and died. The wireless transmitter fell silent. Phillips, exhausted beyond measure, made his way onto the sloping deck. Bride followed. They had done everything wireless telegraphy could do. Now they faced the same choice as every other person aboard: lifeboats or the freezing Atlantic. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's stern rose vertically, hung suspended for a moment that seemed to last forever, then plunged beneath the surface. The largest moving object humans had ever built disappeared into water 2 miles deep, taking 1,514 people with her. 705 survived, floating in lifeboats through a night that seemed endless, waiting for the rescue that Phillips's wireless calls had summoned. The Carpathia arrived at 4 a.m., her searchlights cutting through darkness and fog, finding lifeboats scattered across miles of ocean. Captain Rostron and his crew worked through the dawn, pulling survivors aboard, providing blankets and hot drinks and the profound relief of salvation. Every person saved owed their life partially to wireless telegraphy, to Jack Phillips, who had transmitted until the generators failed, to the electromagnetic network that had connected Carpathia to Titanic across 58 miles of empty ocean. Phillips himself did not survive. He went down with the ship he had served, his last hours spent maintaining the invisible connection that saved 700 others. Harold Bride survived, rescued from an overturned lifeboat, his feet frozen, his body hypothermic, but alive to tell the story of those final wireless transmissions. The disaster transformed maritime law with unprecedented speed. Within months, international conventions mandated 24-hour wireless watches on all passenger vessels. A ship's wireless could never again be shut down for the night, missing distress calls from vessels in trouble. The 500 kilocycle frequency was designated for distress calls only, a clear channel that must remain available for emergencies. Wireless operators, previously seen as technical specialists, became recognized as guardian angels of the sea. Their Morse code, the language of survival. Marconi himself, learning of the disaster, understood that his invention had both failed and succeeded. Failed because more wireless-equipped ships, if present, might have rescued everyone. Succeeded because 705 people lived who would otherwise have died in anonymous darkness, uncommunicating, unknown. Just another ship that vanished without trace. The Titanic disaster proved what peacetime demonstrations could not. That wireless telegraphy was not a luxury or a novelty, but an essential safety system without which no vessel should venture onto the open ocean. Insurance companies began requiring wireless equipment. Port authorities demanded it. Passengers asked about wireless capabilities before booking passage. The electromagnetic web that connected ships at sea became as fundamental to maritime operation as lifeboats and navigation lights. In the years following, wireless saved thousands more. Ships in distress, their engines failed or their hulls breached, could summon help across hundreds of miles. Storms that would have scattered and destroyed fleets in earlier centuries now merely inconvenienced ships that could coordinate movements through wireless communication. The ocean remained dangerous, but it was no longer isolating. Every ship with wireless was connected to every other, part of an invisible network that had transformed the sea from a void of silence into a realm of constant electromagnetic conversation. Jack Phillips's hand on that telegraph key, transmitting through rising water and failing power, became an enduring symbol of wireless telegraphy's purpose. The technology existed not for convenience or profit, but for salvation, for connecting humans across distances that would otherwise divide and isolate them. His final transmissions, racing outward at light speed while the Titanic sank beneath him, carried more than a distress call. They carried humanity's declaration that we would no longer accept separation and silence as inevitable, that we would speak across any distance, that we would hear each other even in the darkest hours. The spark gap transmitter had served wireless telegraphy well for 2 decades, but it was fundamentally crude. Every time the spark leapt across that gap, It generated electromagnetic waves across a broad spectrum of frequencies, like shouting when a whisper would suffice. The spark was loud, inefficient, and occupied far more electromagnetic bandwidth than necessary. It worked, but it was not elegant. Nature rarely tolerates inefficiency for long, especially when better solutions exist. The vacuum tube changed everything. This glass envelope containing almost nothing, housing just a few wires in near-perfect vacuum, could do what sparks could not. It could generate continuous electromagnetic waves at precise frequencies, waves that flowed smoothly rather than erupting in violent bursts. The vacuum tube transformed wireless from a medium of clicks and dashes into a carrier of pure sound, of human voices, of music flowing across continents. In 1920, the first commercial radio stations began broadcasting, and suddenly the electromagnetic spectrum filled with something unprecedented: entertainment. KDKA in Pittsburgh transmitted the presidential election returns. Families gathered around wireless receivers, hearing news as it happened rather than reading about it hours later in newspapers. The human voice, that most intimate form of communication, had learned to travel invisibly through space. Marconi watched this transformation with mixed feelings. He had built his career on wireless telegraphy, on point-to-point communication between specific locations. Broadcasting felt almost like a violation of wireless's proper purpose, sending messages to everyone rather than to carefully selected recipients. But he recognized inevitability when he saw it. Broadcasting would become huge, transforming society in ways even he could not predict. He turned his attention to shortwave communication, a frontier that most wireless engineers had dismissed as useless. Conventional wisdom insisted that long wavelengths, hundreds of meters long, were necessary for long-distance communication. Shorter wavelengths, anything under 100 meters, were thought to travel only line-of-sight distances. Useless for anything beyond local communication, Marconi suspected conventional wisdom was wrong. He had a history of suspecting that. In 1923, he began systematic experiments with wavelengths between 10 and 100 meters, what would later be called shortwave or high-frequency bands. He built transmitters that could generate these short wavelengths, receivers sensitive enough to detect them, antennas designed to radiate them efficiently. The results astonished even him. A 10-meter wave, transmitted with just 20 watts of power, barely more than a light bulb consumes, could circle the globe. The signal bounced between the ionosphere and Earth's surface like a cosmic ping-pong ball, reflecting back and forth, following the planet's curve for thousands of miles. Long-distance communication, which had required kilowatts of power with long wavelengths, could be achieved with trivial amounts of power using short wavelengths. The physics, when eventually understood, revealed an elegant efficiency. Shortwave frequencies reflected off the ionosphere at angles that optimized multiple bounces around the Earth. The ionosphere itself changed character with the sun's position, its reflective properties varying between day and night, creating different propagation paths that skilled operators learned to exploit. A frequency that worked perfectly at noon might be useless at midnight, while a different frequency opened channels to the opposite side of the planet. By 1925, over 600 broadcasting stations filled the electromagnetic spectrum with music, news, drama, and the countless other forms of content that humans create when given a new medium. Radio became furniture, receivers sitting in living rooms, like pianos or bookshelves, gathering families for evening listening sessions. Children who had never seen a wireless antenna understood that invisible waves carried entertainment into their homes. Marconi continued pushing boundaries. He experimented with even shorter wavelengths, microwaves just centimeters long. These waves behaved differently from anything he had worked with before. They traveled in nearly straight lines, barely diffracting around obstacles, more like light beams than traditional radio waves. Most engineers assumed this made them useless for communication. Marconi saw potential. He discovered that microwave beams could be focused into tight patterns, directed precisely towards specific receivers. Two stations could communicate through microwave links without their signals spilling across the landscape, intercepted by anyone with a receiver. The military applications were obvious: secure communication channels that enemy forces could not easily intercept. But Marconi also saw something else. In 1933, he demonstrated that microwave beams reflected strongly from metal objects. A ship 17 miles away, invisible in thick fog, reflected enough microwave energy to be detected and located precisely. He had accidentally invented the fundamental principle of radar, though that word would not be coined for several more years. Electromagnetic waves, which had begun as a means of communication, revealed themselves as a means of seeing through darkness and fog. The experiments with microwaves required different equipment entirely. Wavelengths measured in centimeters demanded antennas measured in centimeters, small dishes and horns that looked nothing like the massive wire arrays of earlier wireless stations. The transmitters and receivers operated at frequencies far beyond what spark gaps or early vacuum tubes could produce. New technologies, klystrons and magnetrons, had to be invented to generate and detect these ultra-short waves. Marconi's laboratories became places where the electromagnetic spectrum was explored systematically, every frequency band tested, every application imagined. His engineers discovered that different frequencies had different characteristics. Very low frequencies, with wavelengths measured in kilometers, could penetrate seawater, allowing communication with submerged submarines. Ultra-high frequencies, with wavelengths measured in centimeters, could carry television signals with enough bandwidth to transmit moving images. The wireless world of 1935 bore little resemblance to the wireless of 1900. Where Marconi had once transmitted single letters across the Bristol Channel, now orchestras performed live in London studios and were heard instantaneously in homes across Europe. Where ships had once been isolated except for occasional Morse code messages, now they maintained continuous voice contact with shore stations. Where fog had once blinded navigation completely, microwave radar gave ships eyes that could see through any weather. But Marconi understood that all of this, the global broadcasting networks, the shortwave communications spanning continents, the microwave systems that would become radar, all of it descended from that first spark in his father's attic. Every innovation was an elaboration of one fundamental discovery. Electromagnetic waves could carry information across space without physical connection. The vacuum tube, which had enabled so much of this evolution, was itself evolving. From simple diodes that could detect signals, tubes became triodes that could amplify them, then tetrodes and pentodes with increasingly sophisticated capabilities. Each improvement in vacuum tube design enabled new applications. Sensitive receivers that could detect signals too weak for earlier equipment. Powerful transmitters that could reach across oceans with clear voice signals. Oscillators that could generate precise frequencies for tuning and selectivity. Radio became a verb. People didn't just listen to wireless anymore. They radioed for help, radioed ahead to announce their arrival, radioed instructions to distant stations. The electromagnetic spectrum, once empty except for natural phenomena, became crowded with human communication. International agreements divided frequencies among different services. Broadcasting allocated specific bands, ship-to-shore communication others, aviation yet more. The invisible had become organized, regulated, managed. Like any other natural resource, Marconi's company had grown into an empire. Marconi stations operated on every continent. Marconi equipment filled ships worldwide. The name Marconi became synonymous with wireless communication itself, the way Xerox would later become synonymous with photocopying. His personal fortune, built on patents and licensing agreements, made him wealthy beyond anything his father could have imagined when he dismissed wireless as an expensive distraction. But wealth and fame did not stop his experimentation. In his 60s, an age when most men retire, Marconi continued testing new frequencies, new antenna designs, new applications for electromagnetic waves. He maintained a laboratory aboard his yacht, the Elettra, conducting experiments while sailing between continents. His notebooks from this period show the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his teenage experiments in Bologna. Measuring, recording, analyzing, forever curious about what electromagnetic waves could do next. The progression from spark gaps to vacuum tubes to microwave systems represented more than technological evolution. It represented humanity's growing sophistication in manipulating the electromagnetic spectrum. We had gone from barely being able to generate electromagnetic waves to sculpting them with precision, choosing frequencies, shaping beam patterns, encoding complex information into invisible carriers that transported it across any distance at light speed. By 1937, radio had become as fundamental to civilization as roads or telegraphs had been in earlier eras. No ship sailed without it. No modern nation operated without broadcasting networks. Aviation depended on radio for navigation and communication. The military had integrated radio into every aspect of operations. Emergency services, police, fire, ambulance, all communicated via radio frequencies allocated specifically for their use. The electromagnetic spectrum, which had been silent except for lightning and solar radiation throughout all of human history until 1895, now sang with thousands of human voices, each transmission a testament to one man's refusal to accept that messages needed wires to fly. Marconi had not just invented a technology, he had given humanity access to a dimension of reality we had never properly utilized, turning invisible waves into the foundation of modern communication. On July 20th, 1937, at 3:45 in the morning, Guglielmo Marconi's heart stopped beating. He was 63 years old, exhausted by a lifetime of relentless experimentation and the heart condition that had troubled him for years. He died in Rome, the city where Italian skeptics had once dismissed his wireless dreams, now a nation that claimed him as one of its greatest sons. The news spread across the electromagnetic web he had created. Radio stations around the world received word via the very technology Marconi had invented. Announcers interrupted regular programming to report that the father of wireless telegraphy had passed. The medium was delivering news of its own creator's death, an impossibility that Marconi had made routine. At 6 p.m. that evening, radio stations across every continent did something unprecedented in human history. For 2 minutes, they fell completely silent. No music, no voices, no Morse code clicking through the ether. The electromagnetic spectrum, which had hummed with human communication constantly since 1900, went quiet. Every transmitter shut down, every broadcaster paused. The invisible ocean of radio waves that had carried human expression for 4 decades suddenly emptied. It was the only moment since wireless communication began that humanity's electromagnetic voice ceased completely. Ships at sea maintained emergency watches, ready to break silence if distress called, but they transmitted nothing. Broadcasting stations stood ready to resume, but their transmitters stayed cold. For 120 seconds, the electromagnetic spectrum returned to something approximating its prehistoric state, carrying only natural phenomena, lightning strikes and solar radiation, the universe's ancient signals that predated human technology. Those 2 minutes were a silence that meant everything. They acknowledged that one man's vision had transformed how 7 billion humans would eventually communicate. They recognized that the world Marconi left behind was fundamentally different from the world he had entered. And that difference existed because he had refused to believe messages needed wires. But here is the profound truth about electromagnetic waves. They never truly stop. The signals Marconi transmitted in 1895, that first successful wireless message sent across his father's estate, those electromagnetic pulses are still traveling. They radiate outward at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, and they have been traveling for over 130 years. By now, those first wireless signals have traversed over 130 light-years of space, passing stars and planets, carrying humanity's first wireless words to regions of the galaxy where no human will travel for millennia. If ever, every transmission since then follows the same inexorable physics. The electromagnetic waves that carried news of the Titanic disaster spread through space forever. The first radio broadcasts, the voices and music that filled the 1920s, all of it continues outward, growing weaker with distance, but never truly disappearing. The universe itself becomes an archive, preserving every electromagnetic signal humanity has ever transmitted, written in patterns of oscillating electric and magnetic fields that will propagate until they encounter something to absorb them. Think about what that means. Any civilization within 130 light-years of Earth, possessing receivers sensitive enough, could detect Marconi's first transmissions arriving as whispers from the cosmos. They would hear humanity's electromagnetic birth, our first tentative words spoken in the language of radio waves. They would hear us learning this new form of expression, growing more sophisticated with each passing year, filling more frequencies with more complex signals. Marconi understood none of this when he pressed that first telegraph key in Bologna. He thought locally, about communication between ships and shore, about messages crossing oceans and continents. He could not have imagined that his invention would become humanity's first truly interstellar communication. Our earliest signals spreading through the galaxy, whether we intended them to or not. Consider your smartphone. Every time it connects to a cell tower, it participates in a direct lineage descending from Marconi's experiments. The frequencies differ. The modulation schemes are far more sophisticated. The power levels are carefully minimized to avoid interference. But the fundamental principle remains identical. Information encoded in electromagnetic waves, transmitted through space without physical connection, received and decoded at a distance. Your Wi-Fi router, your satellite television, your GPS navigation, your wireless headphones, all of them descend from that first spark in an Italian attic. Every technology that uses radio frequencies, from deep space communications with distant spacecraft to the Bluetooth connection between your phone and your car, traces its ancestry to one young man who believed that messages could fly. The world Marconi created is so fundamental to modern civilization that we barely notice it anymore. We expect wireless connectivity the way earlier generations expected roads or running water. We grow frustrated when signals weaken, when connections drop, when the invisible electromagnetic infrastructure fails to deliver instant communication across any distance. We have forgotten how miraculous this would have seemed to anyone living before 1895, but the miracle remains real even when familiarity obscures it. Right now, as you listen to these words, electromagnetic waves are passing through your body, through the walls around you, through the planet itself. Millions of separate signals, each carrying different information, each tuned to specific frequencies, each connecting different points on Earth's surface. Radio stations, cell phones, Wi-Fi networks, satellite communications, radar systems, all of them creating an invisible symphony of electromagnetic energy that flows around and through everything, constantly. Marconi gave our species something unprecedented, the ability to wrap the planet in an invisible web of connection. Before wireless, human communication required physical infrastructure, wires strung between locations, cables laid across ocean floors, messages traveling as electrical currents through conductive materials. After wireless, communication became untethered. Information could flow anywhere, limited only by the power of transmitters and the sensitivity of receivers. This transformation was not merely technical. It was social, cultural, psychological. When ships could communicate with shore, the ocean became smaller. When broadcasting filled the electromagnetic spectrum, culture could spread instantaneously across continents. When individuals could carry wireless communication devices, the very nature of human connection changed. We became reachable anywhere, part of a global network that knows no boundaries except those we deliberately construct. 7 billion humans, each one capable of sending and receiving electromagnetic signals. Each one a node in a planetary communication network that operates continuously. We have become, in a very real sense, a single communicating organism, connected by invisible threads of electromagnetic energy, sharing information at light speed across any distance. This was not Marconi's explicit goal, but it was the inevitable consequence of his discovery. The 2-minute silence on July 20th, 1937 ended. Transmitters powered up. Voices returned to the airwaves. The electromagnetic spectrum filled again with human communication. Life continued, but now everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. The man who had given humanity wireless communication was gone, but his invention remained, growing, evolving, becoming more sophisticated with each passing year. Today, nearly a century after Marconi's death, we live in a world he would barely recognize, yet would understand instantly. The technologies have advanced beyond anything he imagined. Digital modulation, spread spectrum, error correction codes, all represent sophistication far beyond 1930s radio. But strip away the complexity and you find the same principle he discovered in his father's attic. Electromagnetic waves can carry information across space without physical connection. We stand on his shoulders, every one of us who has ever made a cell phone call, streamed a video wirelessly, connected to the internet without cables. We are his descendants in a very real sense, inheritors of the electromagnetic universe he opened for human use. The signals we transmit today will travel outward like his signals traveled, crossing light years, potentially reaching other worlds, carrying human expression into the cosmic void. Marconi's true legacy is not the equipment he built, or the companies he founded, or the fortune he accumulated. His legacy is the invisible connection that binds humanity together, the electromagnetic web that makes communication instant and universal, the transformation of Earth from 7 billion separate humans into a single, communicating organism that thinks, speaks, and shares across every distance at the speed of light. That first spark in Bologna continues resonating through everything we build, every wireless technology we create, every time we take for granted that messages can fly through empty space because one young man refused to believe they couldn't. The eternal signal is not any single transmission, but the principle itself. The understanding that electromagnetic waves can carry human expression, that distance need not divide us, that we can speak across any void and be heard. Marconi heard lightning speak through his mother's piano wires and understood that something profound was being revealed. He spent his life learning that language, teaching it to others, building the infrastructure that would eventually connect every human on Earth. His monument is not made of stone or bronze, but of invisible waves that circle the planet constantly, carrying our thoughts, our voices, our connection to each other through the medium he first learned to manipulate. The wireless world continues evolving. New frequencies, new technologies, new applications emerge continuously. But all of it traces back to those midnight experiments in an Italian attic. To one man's vision that the invisible could be made useful, that the electromagnetic spectrum could become humanity's most important communication medium. Marconi gave us not just a technology, but a future, one where connection transcends distance, where isolation becomes optional, where the human family can speak as one across any void. His signals and ours travel outward forever, writing human history in electromagnetic waves, telling the cosmos that we are here, we are communicating, we have learned to speak in the language of light itself.